As I stand gazing into the vast expanse of human history, a history adorned with the majestic rise and tragic fall of empires, with the brilliance and decay of civilizations, I cannot help but notice that among the many threads woven into this grand tapestry, there exists one particularly sinister strand, one that winds its way silently, relentlessly, through countless generations inbreeding. I have walked through the ancient halls of power, where the whispering echoes of this unsettling practice still linger in the stones and tapestries, from the gilded courts of European royalty to the shadowed sanctuaries of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, and I have borne witness to the haunting melody that it plays soft, eerie, but persistent. Time and again, I have seen how this practice shaped destinies, altered bloodlines, and sealed the fates of entire dynasties. I remember standing before the fragile and broken figure of Charles II of Spain, his frail body a living monument to the consequences of Habsburg inbreeding. His feeble frame riddled with ailments, his inability to sire an heir. These were not merely personal tragedies, but the final withering breath of a once mighty dynasty. And I have wandered along the banks of the Nile into the tombs and temples of the Egyptian kings, where I beheld the legacy of Tutankhamun, a boy king whose twisted bones and compromised health told their own sad tale of brother and sister unions, of a lineage so tightly coiled upon itself that nature could barely sustain it. Yet even as I ponder these grim legacies, I find myself compelled to ask the deeper questions that have haunted my thoughts across the centuries. Why did these rulers, these men and women of such extraordinary power and influence, choose to gamble with nature's fragile balance? Why did they embrace a practice that modern science would later expose as biologically perilous? The answers I have uncovered are as intricate and tangled as the very genetic codes that these unions disrupted. Often, it was the insatiable desire to preserve the purity of their bloodlines, to maintain an unbroken chain of power, to safeguard alliances carefully forged across borders and generations. They believed that by marrying within their own kin, they could prevent the infiltration of unworthy outsiders, fortify their dynasties, and shield their thrones from the grasping hands of political rivals. It was, they thought, a bulwark against chaos, a way to ensure that the crown remained upon the heads of the rightful few. And yet, even as they clutched their fragile thrones and hoarded their power, nature reminded them of its own immutable laws. As Darwin once observed in his reflections on the grand arc of humankind and animal kind alike, those who learned to cooperate, to adapt, and to diversify were the ones who truly prevailed. Time has revealed to me that while inbreeding may have offered a fleeting consolidation of power, it was in truth a treacherous wager, one that more often than not exacted a terrible price. So now, as I invite you to walk beside me through the shadowed corridors of history, to explore these tragic tales and contemplate the far-reaching consequences of this ancient practice, I welcome you into my journal, a chronicle where echoes of Julius Caesar's world still murmur, where the voices of the past rise once more, and where we uncover the dark legacies etched into our shared human story. As I continue my journey through the winding corridors of history, I find myself standing before the complex and unsettling phenomenon of inbreeding itself, that ancient and intricate dance where bloodlines folded back upon themselves like a serpent, devouring its own tail. And as I peer into the distant past, I realize that this practice, though disturbing to modern sensibilities, was once far more prevalent than many would care to imagine. A custom carefully orchestrated by societies scattered across both vast continents and remote isolated islands, each culture weaving its own distinct reasons into this tangled practice. I have heard the voices of ancient rulers, their words carried across centuries, speaking of the need to preserve the sanctity of their lineage, to protect the fragile fabric of their society by binding themselves to those of shared blood. To them, these unions were not simply acts of passion or convenience, but deliberate strategies designed to protect their heritage, secure their wealth, and fortify the very foundations upon which their power rested. In their eyes, marriage was not merely a personal union. It was a political instrument, a symbol of their determination to keep their thrones untainted by foreign hands. And nowhere was this determination more vivid than in the grand and enigmatic kingdom of Egypt, where I have wandered through sun-scorched deserts and stepped cautiously into tombs guarded by jackal-headed chus, where I have beheld the glistening monuments of pharaohs whose reigns still pulse with ancient mystique. Here, amidst the haunting grandeur of pyramids and the cryptic whispers of hieroglyphs, brothers and sisters took each other as spouses under the blazing eye of Ra, preserving the purity of royal bloodlines with a fervor that was as religious as it was political. I have stood in silent witness to the tale of Pharaoh Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti, whose entwined fates embodied the very essence of these traditions, a mixture of unyielding power and intimate passion. Their union not merely a personal choice, but a reflection of a world governed by divine mandate and sacred legacy. To them, the preservation of the royal scepter was paramount, a torch that must never fall into the grasp of the unworthy or the ambitious outsider, for to dilute the bloodline was to risk the very essence of their divine right to rule. And yet, as I drifted across oceans and time, I discovered that these practices were not confined to the banks of the Nile alone. The obsession with pure bloodlines found fertile soil in many distant lands, crossing continents and slipping into the lavish courts of Europe. I remember the imposing palaces of the House of Habsburg, their halls echoing with the weight of centuries, where the same tangled web of intermarriages flourished with an almost obsessive intensity. I have gazed upon the portraits of these proud rulers, their features marked by the infamous Habsburg jaw, a physical testament to the heavy toll exacted by generations of familial unions. Here too, the preservation of power came at a terrible cost, for while the bloodlines remained tightly guarded, the price paid was often etched into the very bodies of their descendants, leaving them vulnerable to afflictions that whispered ominous warnings from within their own veins. And still, my journey did not end there, for I have also wandered into the remote and hidden enclaves of isolated communities, places far removed from the prying eyes of kings and courtiers, where the motives for inbreeding took on different forms entirely. In these secluded pockets, whether upon distant islands or in cloistered villages, choices were shaped not by ambition, but by necessity. The scarcity of potential partners, the harsh constraints of geography, and the unyielding grip of societal customs all conspired to leave little room for alternatives. I have stood upon the rocky shores of Tristan da Cunha, that lonely speck adrift in the vastness of the South Atlantic, where generations of islanders cut off from the rest of the world lived and married within their small circle, the limited gene pool leaving its quiet yet undeniable imprint upon their descendants. And thus, across kingdoms and continents, across palaces and pastures, across grand dynasties and humble hamlets alike, I have borne witness to the same shadowed refrain, the intertwining of close bloodlines, a practice driven by hope, ambition, desperation, and above all, the enduring human desire to preserve that which one holds most dear, no matter the cost that nature may demand in return. As my footsteps echo upon the grand marble floors of Europe's palatial estates, I am drawn irresistibly into the heart of one of history's most cautionary tales, the labyrinthine saga of the House of Habsburg, whose legacy stands not only as a testament to ambition and power, but as a haunting reminder of the price exacted by bloodlines wound too tightly upon themselves. With each turn through this intricate maze, I have observed the dazzling heights they reached and the creeping shadows that slowly consumed them from within. From the quiet origins of their rise in the 11th century, I have watched as the Habsburgs spread their dominion across the map like a great gloved hand clutching vast territories that stretched from the sun-baked plains of Spain to the rolling green hills of Austria and the fortified cities of Hungary. Each alliance, each calculated marriage was like a careful brick laid upon the ever-growing fortress of their power. And yet, as I have learned while tracing these gilded corridors behind the outward splendor of their courts, there lurked a perilous design, a determination shown to keep power encased within the family, to shield their authority from the contamination of foreign blood, no matter how steep the toll demanded by nature. The face of Charles II of Spain haunts me most. I have stood before the fragile paintings that captured his likeness, and I have peered into the eyes of a man trapped by the very blood that should have sustained him. El Hechizado, they called him, the Bewitched, and as I have learned, this title spoke not of sorcery, but of the grim reality bred by generations of unyielding inbreeding. His father, Philip IV, and his mother, Mariana of Austria, uncle and niece, bound together by the unrelenting ambition to guard their dynasty's fragile lineage. And from their union emerged Charles, whose twisted fate stands today as the very embodiment of the Habsburg experiment. I have seen the infamous Habsburg jaw, elongated, protruding, disfigured, etched into his face, as though nature itself had carved a grotesque monument to the price of their obstinacy. But this was only the beginning. His body frail and stunted, his speech impaired, his mind clouded by frequent illness. Charles II bore within him the full measure of the dynasty's genetic debt. The halls of his court whispered endlessly of his ailments, his inability to chew, to speak clearly, to walk without pain, and always the persistent question of whether he could ever produce an heir weighed heavily upon the shoulders of those who surrounded him. And though the physical signs of the Habsburg curse were grotesquely visible, I have also borne witness to the deeper, more insidious consequences that ran unseen beneath the surface. Stillbirths, miscarriages, and infant deaths crept through the lineage like a silent plague, thinning their ranks and casting an ever darker pall over their once unassailable throne. The dwindling pool of heirs was not merely an inconvenience, it was an existential crisis that threatened to topple the very house they had fought so ferociously to defend. And in the end, it was Charles's tragic impotence that sealed their fate. Despite 2 marriages, no heir ever stirred within his queen's womb, and with his death, in 1700, the great bloodline that had once dominated Europe stood extinguished, its final flicker snuffed out by the consequences of their own design. I have watched the storm that followed, how the throne of Spain became the battleground for the War of the Spanish Succession, as kings and princes across Europe scrambled to fill the vacuum left behind by the crumbling Habsburg dominion. And so, as I walk once more through these silent palaces, where portraits of twisted jaws still hang in gilded frames, I cannot help but reflect on the terrible irony that lies at the heart of their ambition. For though they sought immortality through the purity of their blood, it was that very pursuit that condemned them, leaving behind only their fragile bones and their sorrowful lessons whispered still through the corridors of history. As I turn my gaze upon the misty isles of Britain, where ancient castles loom against gray skies and royal banners flutter in the cold winds, I find myself once again walking the quiet, gilded corridors of power, tracing the twisting, tangled bloodlines of the British monarchy, a dynasty less notorious than the Egyptian pharaohs or the doomed Habsburgs in their ruthless pursuit of purity, yet one that nonetheless bears its own scars, delicately woven into the very fabric of its enduring legacy. I have stood in the great halls where kings once plotted and queens once whispered, and I have seen how in the centuries long before genetics unveiled its secrets, the British royals too sought to strengthen their rule through carefully chosen unions, often within their own extended kin, believing that by tethering blood to blood, they might forge alliances too strong for any rival to sunder. The echoes of these choices reverberate most clearly when I cast my eyes upon the reign of King Edward III, who wore the crown from 1327 until his death in 1377, his marriage to Philippa of Hainault, his own second cousin, a seemingly modest pairing by the standards of royalty, yet one whose consequences would ripple far beyond their time. For it was through these unions, deliberate and strategic, that their descendants would come to populate the thrones and palaces of Europe, their veins pulsing with shared royal blood, weaving a web so dense that generations later it would encircle the entire continent. And as my journey carries me forward, I arrive at the reign of Queen Victoria, whose long dominion from 1837 to 1901 would earn her the moniker, the Grandmother of Europe, for through her children, her bloodlines would spread like vines across the great royal houses of the continent. I have watched her court resplendent with its traditions and gilded etiquette, and I have seen how she herself, in marrying her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, perpetuated the long-standing royal custom of marrying within familiar bloodlines. Their union, though filled with deep affection and a shared sense of duty, brought forth 9 children, each destined to marry into the royal families of Germany, Russia, Denmark, Spain, and beyond, until nearly every throne bore descendants of Victoria and Albert, their shared blood binding together a continent's nobility. Yet, as I peer closer beyond the grandeur of their portraits and the glittering jewels they wore, I see the darker consequence that would emerge from these tightly woven ties, a silent affliction creeping like a ghost through the royal nurseries. Hemophilia, that cruel blood-clotting disorder that would come to be known as the royal disease. It was within Victoria herself that this hidden gene took root, and through her many children it would spread quietly into distant royal courts, striking down princes and young heirs in its path. I have stood beside the shadowed cradle of her son, Leopold, Duke of Albany, whose life was fraught with suffering from this merciless condition, each fall or bruise bringing the specter of internal bleeding, every minor injury a potential death sentence. And far beyond Britain's shores, I have watched as the disease found its way into the imperial family of Russia, where young Tsarevich Alexei, great-grandson of Victoria, inherited his tragic burden, a burden that would haunt the Russian Empire in its final hours. As the 20th century dawned, I observed the winds of change begin to stir through Britain's ancient halls. The once common practice of uniting close relatives faded, replaced by a cautious distance as science and society together whispered new warnings about the risks their ancestors had ignored. And yet, even as these royal marriages began to look outward, the legacy of interwoven bloodlines remained etched into the genealogies of the modern monarchy. I have watched Queen Elizabeth II and her consort Prince Philip stand side by side, their union reflecting a gentler echo of these old traditions, for they too were third cousins, both tracing their lineage back to Victoria and Albert. But since their marriage, I have seen no further close familial unions arise within the British royal family, a quiet acknowledgement, perhaps, of lessons painfully learned. And so, as I leave these royal chambers behind, I carry with me the bittersweet tale of a dynasty whose web of blood once stretched across nations, a story of strength and vulnerability, of unity and fragility, and of how even the mightiest can be humbled by the hidden threads of heredity woven into their crowns. As I peer ever deeper into the veiled mysteries of life itself, I find myself standing at the threshold of a world far older than any kingdom, any throne or any dynasty, a world woven not from politics or ambition, but from the intricate strands of heredity, where the invisible hand of genetics guides the destinies of all living beings, often silently, often without mercy. And as I tread this path, I have come to see how the consequences of inbreeding, though born from human ambition and necessity, are ultimately governed by forces far beyond the grasp of kings and queens. I have watched as ancient rulers from the pharaohs of Egypt to the Habsburg emperors arranged marriages between siblings and cousins, believing that By binding their bloodlines ever tighter, they could fortify their reigns against the chaos of the outside world. Yet I have also seen how hidden within those same tightly wound threads of ancestry there lurked unseen dangers, silent mutations and recessive traits patiently waiting for their moment to rise, their destructive power magnified with each turn of the familial spiral. For centuries, these consequences remained shrouded in mystery, their causes unknown to the rulers who suffered beneath their weight. But then, as the 19th century dawned, I witnessed a new chapter unfold, a quiet revolution born not in royal courts, but in a humble monastery garden, where a man named Gregor Mendel gently tended to his rows of pea plants. With careful observation and unyielding patience, Mendel uncovered the secret patterns by which traits passed from one generation to the next, laying the first stones of a discipline that would one day be called genetics. I watched with awe as Mendel's simple yet profound laws of inheritance revealed the hidden mechanics behind the tragedies I had seen play out across history. The club foot of Tutankhamun, the hemophilia of Victoria's heirs, the twisted jaw of Charles II, all the haunting legacies of bloodlines bound too tightly. With Mendel's discovery, the shadowy whispers of fate took form, transforming into measurable laws, into charts and probabilities that could at last be understood. And yet, even as Mendel's work illuminated these ancient mysteries, it was but the beginning of a far greater journey, a journey that I continued to follow into the 20th century, where minds like Sir Ronald Aylmer Fisher advanced the field still further. I stood in quiet contemplation as Fisher introduced the concept of the coefficient of inbreeding, a simple, elegant formula that could calculate the odds of inherited sameness at the genetic level, quantifying at last the hidden cost of those royal gambles. But as I walked from the past into the present, I saw that the story of inbreeding was not merely one of palaces and dynasties long dead. Even now, in isolated corners of the world, its shadow lingers. I have stood upon the island of Pingalap, a tiny speck adrift in the vast Pacific, where the survivors of a devastating typhoon in 1775 rebuilt their community from the fragile remnants of just a few ancestors unwittingly spreading a rare condition called achromatopsia, total color blindness through their descendants, like a ghostly echo of their desperate beginnings. And yet, in the face of these quiet tragedies, I have also witnessed hope arise from the steady hand of science. The advent of genetic counseling has brought a measure of light into these once darkened corridors, empowering families to face the risks of inherited disease with knowledge rather than fear. I have watched as pioneers like Sheldon Reed, who first coined the term genetic counseling in the 1940s, offered guidance to countless families, helping them to navigate the treacherous waters of reproduction, armed now with maps written not in superstition, but in the language of DNA. Where once rulers blindly arranged unions for political gain, today I see individuals armed with understanding, choosing paths, informed by science rather than tradition. Their choices no longer chained to the same fatal ignorance that doomed so many before them. And though the invisible hand of heredity still shapes us all, we now hold within our grasp the power to soften its grip, to rewrite its darker chapters, and to guide future generations toward a healthier, more prosperous fate. As I step away from the opulent courts of human kings and the guarded palaces of emperors, I find myself venturing into the vast and untamed wilderness, where nature herself writes her own strange and paradoxical rules, rules that both echo and defy the tragic patterns I have observed in humankind. And here, amidst the trees, the rivers, the mountains, and the distant islands, I witness the wild dance of genes playing out in ways that both astonish and humble me. For in the kingdom of animals, inbreeding often walks a different path, one shaped not by ambition or pride, but by the raw necessities of survival. I have stood in quiet observation as creatures great and small carried out their instinctive rituals, sometimes mating within their own close lines, not through conscious choice or royal decree, but through the natural constraints imposed by isolation, by scarcity, or by the strange designs of evolution itself. And it was here in these places untouched by human law that I first began to see the startling complexity of inbreeding as it exists beyond the world of kings. I recall the early 19th century when Charles Darwin, whose voice still echoes softly in my ear, first turned his keen gaze toward this phenomenon. I watched as he studied not only the towering trees and the distant birds of the Galapagos, but also the quiet simplicity of plants in his own gardens, conducting careful experiments on self-fertilization, observing how even among the green stalks of peas and flowers, the marriage of close relatives often led to diminished vigor, to weaker offspring, to infertility. A gentle but persistent warning whispered through the leaves. Yet as my path carried me forward, I saw that nature was not always so cruelly rigid. When I visited the shrinking territories of the Florida panther, a creature once proud and plentiful, I saw how their dwindling numbers forced them into unavoidable unions among close kin. And there, as the population fell to fewer than 30 desperate survivors, I witnessed the consequences take root. Fragile hearts, misshapen tails, impaired fertility, all signs that the gene pool had grown dangerously shallow. But then, as if in answer to the panther's silent plea, I watched as human hands intervened, not with royal edicts, but with compassion and science. In 1995, 8 Texas cougars were introduced into Florida's wildlands, their foreign blood mixing with the panther's weary lineage. And as the generations turned, I saw vitality return to the once doomed population, a living testament to the power of what modern scientists now call genetic rescue and to the quiet resilience of life itself. My journey then carried me across the boundless ocean to the remote Galapagos Islands, where isolation reigns supreme and where nature's strange experiments unfold across volcanic slopes. There I observed the Galapagos hawks, whose limited numbers have led them to mate within their small group for countless generations. And yet, unlike the panthers, I saw no immediate collapse, no visible affliction. The hawks, it seems, have found ways to purge harmful mutations across time, a delicate balance struck between danger and adaptation, a marvel of nature's slow and meticulous patience. And still, I traveled onward, shrinking myself in thought, to enter the miniature worlds of insects, where nature's rules twist even further. I watched the intricate societies of ants and bees where sisters share near-identical genes and cooperation reigns supreme. Here, haplodiploidy, a curious system where males hatch from unfertilized eggs carrying only their mother's chromosomes, creates colonies that thrive not in spite of genetic similarity, but because of it, their societies bound together by an extraordinary harmony born of shared blood. As I step back and survey this strange menagerie of genetic stories, I see that nature, unlike man, does not obey one law alone. She allows inbreeding at times, she punishes it at others, and she shapes her creatures with tools both harsh and forgiving, always seeking a balance between vulnerability and resilience. And in witnessing this wild dance of genes, I am reminded that while human ambition may have driven inbreeding to tragic excess, nature's designs are far more complex, far more mysterious, and far more adaptive than we often dare to imagine. As I leave behind the open wilderness where animals conduct their quiet experiments with blood and inheritance, I once more return to the world of mankind, not to the grand palaces of emperors or the marble halls of kings, but to the secluded enclaves where ordinary people bound by circumstance rather than ambition have lived their lives in quiet isolation. forgotten by the world, yet whispering the same haunting echoes of inbreeding that I have heard in courts and dynasties across time. I have stood on the rocky shores of Tristan da Cunha, that tiny dot adrift in the boundless South Atlantic, where the sea endlessly pounds against jagged cliffs and where a handful of settlers, drawn together by chance and exile, founded a small community far removed from the sprawling empires of Europe. From the moment the British Navy established its tiny outpost in 1816 to prevent French ambitions during the Napoleonic Wars, I have watched as generation after generation of islanders married within their narrow circle, not out of pride or royal decree, but because no one else remained to choose from. And as the decades passed, I observed how this isolation carved its mark upon the people, not with crowns or palatial portraits, but with quiet afflictions hidden deep within their cells. I saw retinitis pigmentosa slowly dimming the vision of many a genetic condition, creeping through the generations, its inheritance as steady as the rhythm of the ocean that surrounds them. Even now, as I walk among their vibrant and determined community, I sense both their resilience and the quiet weight of their genetic legacy, a legacy not chosen but inherited through circumstance. Yet not all isolation is born of geography. As I journey across oceans and continents, I encounter other communities where cultural walls have risen just as high as any mountain range. I have found myself standing beneath the guarded gates of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a community tucked into the American landscape, shielded by its beliefs and customs from the outside world. Here, polygamy, large families, and strict separation from modern society have built a population that draws heavily upon the blood of a few founding ancestors, generation after generation, folding upon itself. I have seen the genetic consequences emerge within these tight circles most chillingly in the form of fumarase deficiency, a devastating neurological disorder that slowly robs children of their development and abilities, casting a long and heartbreaking shadow across families bound together by faith and tradition. I have watched as the leaders' men like Warren Jeffs tightened the reins of isolation, ever further unwittingly deepening the genetic risks that now burden many within the community. And yet, even as I witness these tragedies unfold, I also observe an extraordinary human resilience, a determination among these isolated people to hold fast to their way of life, to bear the burdens that their circumstances have handed them, and to endure with quiet strength in the face of what fate and biology have combined to deliver. In these places, on windswept islands, and within the guarded compounds of religious enclaves, I am reminded that the story of inbreeding is not solely one of kings and queens, nor only of power and ambition. It is also a tale of geography, of culture, of necessity, and of the complex and often painful relationship between human society and the silent forces of heredity that shape us all, whether we rule empires or till modest fields beneath distant stars. As my long journey through the twisted corridors of bloodlines and inheritance carries me into the modern world, I find myself standing beneath the towering banners of science, a realm where the once murky shadows of heredity are now illuminated by the cool, precise glow of knowledge, where humanity at last holds in its hands the powerful tools to confront the specter of inbreeding that has haunted its history for millennia. I recall with vivid clarity the monumental moment when in the year 2003, the Human Genome Project reached its triumphant conclusion, and for the first time we gazed upon the entirety of our genetic blueprint, a complex map of 3 billion letters that, when read correctly, reveal both the promises and perils woven into our very essence. As I stood at the edge of this scientific frontier, I marveled at how this extraordinary achievement had flung open doors that had remained sealed since the dawn of kings and pharaohs, offering us the chance not only to peer into the secrets of our ancestry, but to rewrite the narratives that had long been dictated by chance and ignorance. No longer must we stumble blindly into the same genetic traps that once ensnared the children of royal courts and isolated villages for genetic testing has become our lantern shining into the hidden recesses of our chromosomes, revealing the recessive mutations that, when paired through inbreeding, may give rise to devastating disorders. I have watched as families no longer resigned to fate consult these tests to learn whether the blood they share carries hidden dangers, whether their union might awaken dormant afflictions lurking quietly beneath the surface of their lineage. One such beacon of hope glows brightly within the Dor Yeshorim program, which I have seen take root among the tightly knit Ashkenazi Jewish communities of Brooklyn. Founded in the 1980s by Rabbi Joseph Eckstein, a man who had already buried 4 of his children to the cruel ravages of Tay-Sachs disease, this program transformed tragedy into a powerful shield. I have watched as young couples, through confidential genetic screening, are quietly matched or gently cautioned, their futures protected from the silent gamble that once devastated so many before them. Yet testing alone is not the full armor we now wear for. I have also seen the rise of the genetic counselor, modern-day guides, who, like lighthouses in treacherous waters, help individuals and families navigate the swirling currents of heredity. I remember how in the mid-20th century, Sheldon Reed first gave voice to this calling, coining the term genetic counseling, and establishing the foundation for a profession built not on fear, but on understanding, on the belief that knowledge empowers rather than condemns. Through their steady hands, countless people have come to understand their risks, to weigh their options, and to make informed choices where once there had only been blind chance. And in these intimate consultations, I have seen the faces of parents-to-be, their brows furrowed not by royal ambition, but by love, as they strive to give their children the gift of health that so many past generations could never guarantee. As I stand beneath the towering architecture of modern genetics, I see not only the triumph of science over the mistakes of history, but a quiet redemption, a chance for humanity to break free from the old chains of ignorance that bound our ancestors. Where once rulers clung to bloodlines with reckless pride, we now walk carefully among the intricate strands of DNA, no longer fearing what is hidden, but embracing what can be revealed, and more importantly, what can be prevented. And though the ancient dangers of inbreeding still linger in some corners of the world, I take comfort knowing that with each generation, these guardians of genetics continue to sharpen their tools, their knowledge growing ever deeper, ensuring that the tragedies I have witnessed in the royal chambers and the isolated islands may in time become little more than distant echoes from a past we have finally learned to leave behind. As my journey winds onward through the intricate and often painful history of bloodlines, I find myself stepping into yet another realm, one not governed by the mysteries of nature or the ambitions of monarchs, but by the measured hand of human law, where societies have sought to regulate, restrain, and sometimes even forbid the unions that once unfolded so freely beneath the banners of royal ambition and necessity. And here, amid the tangled lattice of legislation, I witness a new struggle, a delicate balancing act between the ancient desires of the heart and the sobering truths revealed by science. I have wandered through the patchwork legal landscape of the United States, where each state, like a sovereign island, has drawn its own boundary around the question of consanguineous marriage. In some corners, such as Rhode Island and New Jersey, I have seen the law permit first cousins to wed, allowing familial bonds to continue in ways still deemed acceptable by some traditions. Yet as I move westward into Texas and Arizona, I watch as the gavel falls hard, forbidding these same unions entirely, a reflection of the growing awareness of the genetic hazards that have long haunted such pairings, as well as the enduring debate between personal liberty and public health. Crossing oceans and cultures, I have found other legal tapestries equally intricate and revealing. In South Korea, I once stood beneath the rigid framework of the same surname and same origin clause, a law that for centuries forbade marriage between individuals sharing the same ancestral surname and hometown, regardless of how distantly related they might have been. Born from a desire to protect the integrity of bloodlines and guard against inbreeding, this law persisted stubbornly into the twilight of the 20th century, until finally, in 1997, the rising tide of social change swept it away, dismantling a rule that had grown too restrictive for a modernizing world. Yet not all battles over inbreeding have played out quietly within courtrooms or legislative chambers. I remember standing in England watching the strange case of the Haldane sisters unfold a curious intersection of genetics law and human determination. In 1935, Helen Spurway, wife of the renowned geneticist J.B.S. Haldane, and her sister Naomi Mitchison, both carriers of a gene linked to night blindness, dared to approach legal boundaries that few had ever tested. They proposed marrying the same man, a man free of the defective gene, hoping to protect their children from the affliction that darkened their family's history. Though they never carried through with the plan, the public debate they sparked forced an entire nation to confront the emerging realities of genetics, inbreeding, and reproductive choice. Venturing onward, I have walked the quiet streets of Canudos, Brazil, a community once marked by frequent consanguineous unions where officials chose not the rigid arm of prohibition, but instead wielded the gentler tools of education and awareness. Through the Programa Saúde da Família, I watched as health workers taught villagers about the genetic risks quietly carried within their veins. And in time, I witnessed a steady decline in such marriages, a powerful testament to the potential of knowledge itself as a far more effective barrier than any legal decree. Everywhere I go, I see that the struggle to manage inbreeding reflects a deeper tension that has haunted humankind since the earliest days of kings and peasants alike. A tension between freedom and consequence, between desire and duty, between the instinct to protect family honor and the responsibility to protect future generations from suffering. And though laws may shift and evolve with the times, the ancient forces of heredity remain constant, quietly shaping the choices we make and the futures we build. As I move forward, leaving behind these legal battlegrounds, I carry with me a growing sense of both caution and hope, for while the law may draw its lines in ink and statute, it is ultimately knowledge, compassion, and the humility to learn from our past that will decide whether we continue to stumble down the old paths of tragedy or rise instead to forge a wiser road ahead. As I continue my solemn walk through the hidden corridors of our genetic inheritance, I come upon a gallery of afflictions, echoes of the past, that have emerged from the fragile unions of shared blood. Their presence stretching across continents and generations like haunting melodies that refuse to fade. Each disorder a cruel reminder of how nature punishes the narrowing of her infinite diversity. I have stood at the bedside of countless children whose suffering tells stories far older than their young faces. Among them, I have seen those afflicted by cystic fibrosis, a relentless enemy of breath and digestion. Its origins stretching deep into the ancient soil of the Fertile Crescent, where it is believed that thousands of years ago, carriers of this mutation may have unknowingly held a survival advantage, their altered bodies resisting the lethal dehydration brought on by cholera. Yet in the world I walk today, where cholera's grip has weakened, cystic fibrosis remains as a deadly inheritance, a ghost of nature's cruel trade-offs, striking hardest among people of European descent, its thick mucus slowly strangling the lungs, its burden passed silently from parent to child. As my journey carries me eastward into the sun-drenched lands of the Middle East, I witness another twisted branch of this hereditary tree, thalassemia. Like sickle cell anemia in Africa, this disorder once offered a strange kind of protection, its altered hemoglobin granting partial defense against malaria's fevered assault. But now, in malaria's absence, thalassemia reveals only its sharp edges, its victims suffering from severe anemia, their bodies locked in endless battles for oxygen, their lives tethered to transfusions and medicine. Even in ancient writings, when I read the words of Hippocrates, I hear faint descriptions of its symptoms, like distant whispers traveling from the cradle of Western medicine to my waiting ears. But the genetic echoes do not stop with ancient civilizations, for as I sail across the Pacific, I arrive once more upon the lonely island of Pingalap, a name now forever entwined with the story of complete achromatopsia, or total color blindness. I have stood upon its shores gazing into the faces of people who see the world forever in shades of gray, their retinas cursed by a genetic bottleneck that began when a devastating typhoon in 1775 left just 20 survivors to repopulate the island, one of whom carried the defective gene. And from that single fragile thread, the disorder spread like ink across a page, its legacy still visible today. Yet even as I catalog these genetic burdens, I also bear witness to the rising hope that modern science has kindled. I have seen the laboratories where gene therapy now dares to rewrite the stories once thought immutable, where geneticists like quiet artisans insert, remove, and correct the very codes that dictate life's course. In 2017, I watched as the FDA approved the first gene therapy for a form of inherited blindness, a quiet triumph that, like a flickering candle in the dark, promises that perhaps someday conditions like cystic fibrosis, thalassemia, and achromatopsia may be softened, even reversed. And in these sterile rooms filled with microscopes and pipettes, I have watched pioneers like Dr. James Wilson and Dr. Jean Bennett carve the path forward, their work illuminating new frontiers in treatments once thought impossible. The promise of gene therapy is no longer distant myth. It breathes in the air of every clinic, in every child whose parents dare hope for cures undreamed of in generations past. Beyond therapy, I have also watched the cautious hands of embryologists employ pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, a powerful tool that allows embryos created through in vitro fertilization to be screened for dangerous mutations before implantation, offering families the chance to prevent suffering before life even begins. Here science steps gently, where nature once stomped blindly, guiding fragile futures onto safer paths. And as I linger within this delicate chamber of science and hope, I am reminded once again of the long journey that brought us here, from ancient royalty to isolated islands, from silent suffering to measured prevention. Though the past still whispers its tragedies, I can now see with cautious optimism that the chorus of suffering may one day fall silent, replaced by a gentler melody of healing, guided by the steady hands of those who have dared to unlock the most secret language ever written, the language of our very blood. As I step once more beyond the realm of human inheritance, I find myself walking among the carefully controlled sanctuaries of zoos and the sprawling laboratories of global conservation programs, where men and women armed with the knowledge of genetics and the humility of experience attempt to do what kings, queens, and isolated communities failed to achieve: to manage bloodlines not for pride or power, but for survival itself. For here, the very existence of entire species teeters upon the razor's edge of genetic diversity. I have stood behind the heavy glass of enclosures where endangered creatures gaze back at me, each animal not merely a living being, but a fragile vessel carrying the last remnants of genetic variation their kind still possesses. And as I observe, I understand that these modern-day custodians of life face a paradox, both familiar and daunting: how to breed enough to save a species without slipping into the dangerous spiral of inbreeding that has haunted both man and beast throughout history. I remember the year 1981 when the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums launched what would become one of the most ambitious and carefully orchestrated genetic rescue missions ever attempted: the Species Survival Plan. And I watched as the keepers of lowland gorillas, whose populations had dwindled alarmingly, began their meticulous work pairing mates not by chance or convenience, but by detailed genetic records, each match carefully calculated to maximize diversity, like a grand and delicate game of chess, played with the very threads of life itself. As the years unfolded, I witnessed their success, and soon their methods were replicated for countless other endangered species, turning zoos from mere exhibits into repositories of genetic stewardship, living arks built not of wood, but of data compassion and careful breeding charts. Yet even with these triumphs, I have seen the countless challenges they still face. I return once more to the familiar shadow of the Florida panther, whose near extinction I had witnessed earlier, as their population dwindled to fewer than 30 animals, each one bearing the unmistakable signs of prolonged inbreeding. Twisted tails, weakened hearts, faltering fertility, a genetic warning written across their very bodies. And then I saw the bold move made in 1995 when 8 female Texas cougars were introduced into the dwindling gene pool. As their bloodlines mingled, I watched life surge back into the panther population, a breathtaking testament to the power of genetic rescue when wielded with wisdom and urgency. But my path stretches further still to the Galapagos Islands, where the ancient giants, the tortoises whose shells have borne silent witness to nature's experiments for centuries, have become another battlefield in the war against inbreeding. Here I observed the careful efforts of the Giant Tortoise Restoration Initiative, where scientists paired individuals from separate island populations, crafting diverse lineages like artisans repairing a shattered mosaic. Each careful union, another step toward saving a species pushed to the brink by both human folly and genetic fragility. And still, I continue my journey, bringing me to the towering cliffs and open skies where the California condor once soared freely. I watched with quiet admiration as breeding programs pulled these majestic birds back from the edge of extinction. Yet even as their numbers rose, I saw the new challenges emerge. For breeding is not enough when wild habitats are vanishing, when dangers like lead poisoning claim lives, even as we fight to preserve them. The battle against inbreeding, I have learned, is only one part of a far greater war for survival. In all these sanctuaries, whether in cages or in wild reserves, I see reflected the same eternal truth that history has taught me again and again, that nature demands diversity, that life withers when bloodlines fold too tightly, and that the price of failing to honor this rule is always steep, whether paid by royal heirs or panthers in swamps, by islanders or by tortoises on volcanic slopes. Yet even as I bear witness to these fragile struggles, I am filled with a cautious reverence, for though our past is crowded with mistakes here in the patient work of conservationists and geneticists, I see at last the possibility of redemption, a way for humanity to become not the careless architect of extinction, but the vigilant guardian of life's delicate and beautiful complexity. As I step out from the chambers of history and the laboratories of science, I find myself drifting into the realm of human imagination, where quills scratch across parchment, cameras roll beneath blinding lights, and storytellers, both ancient and modern, pluck threads from the haunting tapestry of inbreeding, weaving them into tales of power, tragedy, and forbidden love that both mirror and magnify the truths I have witnessed throughout my long journey. I have wandered through the sprawling, brutal world of Westeros, where George R.R. Martin's epic saga Game of Thrones unfurls its treacherous branches, and where the Lannister twins Cersei and Jaime stand as perhaps the most striking fictional embodiment of aristocratic inbreeding. I have watched their secret love ignite scandals and wars, their incestuous bond wrapped in both tenderness and calculation, producing children who wear crowns stained with hidden shame. And in their twisted tale, I hear echoes of real dynasties long past, of pharaohs, Habsburgs, and monarchs whose own obsessions with preserving bloodlines led them down similar dangerous paths, their personal desires and political ambitions tangled into one inseparable knot. As I move through the flickering screens of modern media, I find myself standing within the elegant yet tightly wound halls of Buckingham Palace, brought to life by the acclaimed series The Crown. Though far less scandalous than the Lannisters' dark romance, I see how this dramatization of Britain's royal family gently pulls back the curtains on centuries of intermarriage among Europe's noble houses, reflecting how the weight of tradition once guided royal hearts toward cousins, rather than strangers, with each union tightening the web of shared ancestry across the continent. It is not always spoken aloud, but beneath the surface of the royal pageantry, I sense the quiet presence of bloodlines carefully managed, their historical consequences never far from view. But fiction's fascination with inbreeding stretches even further into unsettling territory, where shadows grow darker still. I have sat in silent witness to the chilling Spanish film, The Nameless, where a secretive cult pursues inbreeding as a twisted path toward creating a pure, elevated lineage, its members blinded by fanaticism, their ideology poisoning the very essence of their humanity. In their quest for purity, I see a distorted reflection of the real-world obsessions that once drove kings to marry sisters' uncles, to wed nieces and entire dynasties, to collapse beneath the weight of their own unbending pride. Crossing continents again, I find myself immersed in the delicate panels of Japanese manga, where the series Koi Kaze dares to explore the taboo through a story of a brother and sister long separated and unknowingly reunited as adults, their unexpected romantic bond forcing both characters and audience alike to confront the emotional and moral complexities of such forbidden connections. It is neither royal nor political, but deeply personal, illuminating how inbreeding's shadow can reach beyond courts and castles into the quiet corners of ordinary lives. In all these tales, whether born of fantasy, history, horror, or gentle introspection, I recognize the same ancient chords that have hummed beneath my entire journey, the fragile interplay between love and duty, between desire and consequence, between the longing to preserve lineage and the dangers that such preservation often invites. Storytellers, I have learned, are drawn again and again to this theme not because it is distant and exotic, but because it is painfully familiar, a reflection of our shared human struggle to reconcile the heart's longing with nature's quiet but unyielding rules. And so, as I leave behind these fictional landscapes, I carry with me a deeper understanding that inbreeding's legacy does not belong only to science or history. It lingers in our stories, our art, our fears, and our fascinations, a dark thread woven through both fact and fiction, forever reminding us of the peril that lies in seeking purity, where diversity was always nature's true design. As I reach the final stretch of my long and winding journey through the tangled corridors of bloodlines, genetics, and history, I find myself pausing at the threshold where the past gently hands its lessons to the present, and where the future, still unwritten, waits, with both quiet promise and silent caution. I have walked beside kings and peasants, crossed oceans and centuries, witnessed both the intimate tragedies of families and the grand collapses of dynasties, all linked by that fragile, invisible thread of inheritance, which, though silent, governs us all. In every face I have seen, whether twisted by deformity in Habsburg courts or dimmed by a chromatopsia on the shores of Pingelap, I have been reminded of the breathtaking complexity of nature's design, a design that yields great beauty when its diversity flourishes, but can turn merciless when narrowed and confined by human hands. I have traced these stories through palaces, laboratories, remote islands, and even into the fictional worlds of imagination, where our collective fascination with bloodlines continues to echo, as though we still seek to understand something ancient and unresolved about ourselves. And yet, as I now stand at the edge of our modern age, I feel a strange and powerful hope rising, a hope born not from naive optimism, but from the extraordinary tools that science has placed within our reach. The rapid march of genetic research has in many ways lifted the heavy fog that once concealed the causes behind so many inherited tragedies. Where once kings consulted oracles and priests today, we consult geneticists and counselors, reading the very script written into our DNA with a clarity unimaginable to those who came before. I recall the words of J.B.S. Haldane, the brilliant British geneticist whose insights I have carried with me like a compass, who once mused that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And as I peer into the swirling depths of the human genome, I see the truth of his words unfold before me. For within those twisting chains of molecules lie mysteries still waiting to be unraveled. Surprises both wondrous and unsettling. Each discovery a reminder of how little we yet grasp of the forces that shape us. Yet unlike the rulers of old, who clung blindly to their bloodlines in defiance of nature's laws, we now hold in our hands the power to choose differently, to preserve diversity, to prevent suffering, and to intervene when nature's coin toss threatens to yield cruel outcomes. The completion of the Human Genome Project. The rise of gene therapy, the careful guidance of genetic counseling, these are no longer distant dreams, but living realities that have already begun reshaping the stories of countless families who might otherwise have been trapped in the same tragic patterns I have seen repeated through history. Still, I remain humble before the enormity of what we have yet to learn, for every answer reveals new questions, and the delicate balance between intervention and acceptance remains one of science's most profound ethical frontiers. We may now walk more confidently through the dance of inheritance, but nature's rhythm is intricate, and its lessons are not easily exhausted. And so, as I close this chapter of my exploration, I leave you with a quiet invitation to embrace the mystery that pulses within every strand of DNA, to listen to the ancient whispers carried by our blood, not as chains that bind us to past mistakes, but as teachers guiding us toward wisdom, compassion, and responsibility. For as Charles Darwin once confessed, the mystery of the beginning of all things may remain forever insoluble, and I too must be content to remain an agnostic before the grandest questions. But though the answers may elude us, our journey of discovery will continue just as it always has.